Hey, good morning, students. It's Thursday, April 16th. Two things I want to do today. One, to review the reading that I gave you on Tuesday. The questions were due today. And then to also introduce the reading um, that is presented today on Thursday. So, with regard to Tuesday, I gave you some primary sources that talked about slavery in the Americas. I also encouraged you to grab my pointer here to watch the 4.5 minute clip from the Ken Burns documentary, The Civil War. And I mentioned those yesterday as well. Document A, I think this is pretty easily understood just to showcase how it was that slaves were viewed, written in their master's account book, along with horses, sheep, and pigs. You can see being treated um, as property as opposed to people, and then the idea that they're not allowed in law to have a wife or children or have ownership of anything. To eat the fruit of his own labor is considered stealing, right? That you might work um, tirelessly to produce something, whether it be a food crop or otherwise, but yet you don't enjoy the fruit of your labor. When you look at document B, this one was a little bit of a mystery, um, because I'm asking you in what colony it would have taken place in. Well, it borders South Carolina, so that would narrow it down for you. But then later on, it also talks about the Carolinas, which means that it can't be North Carolina. The answer is actually Georgia. When Georgia was first founded as a colony, it actually did not allow slavery. But because things could be done more cheaply in other colonies like South Carolina or North Carolina, Georgia actually asked to adopt slavery. So Georgia didn't have slavery, and then did have slavery, and then obviously after the Civil War, slavery was gone from the state of Georgia. But the idea that the argument here is one of economic benefit. It wasn't so much as I believe document D goes into about who the slaves were. It was more about well, financially we can't keep up because we would have to pay our workers, whereas people in South Carolina would not have to pay their workers, and therefore their prices would be lower. So a very economic argument for slavery, obviously still very morally wrong, but just the way they argued for slavery, and very sad that Georgia started without slavery but then adopted it. Document C, this gets at the title of the unit, right? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? So this was a speech given by Frederick Douglass, as I said the other day, in the mid 1850s. And then just some of the language he uses. As you can see, these little ellipses here. I'm skipping over a number of things, but you can find this document. I think it's something like it's probably roughly like 11 pages long. I answer a day that reveals to him more than any other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he's the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. And I mentioned this, the idea that people are celebrating independence and freedom and liberty without acknowledging perhaps the hypocrisy, right? That exists, that you would take a day to celebrate those things while millions of fellow Americans are enslaved. And then finally, document D. This sort of connects both of those arguments for slavery. So this would be a very pro-slavery voice here. The one talking about how the author thinks there's a biological reason for slavery when he talks about being stamped on the skin. But then he gets into the argument that is sort of shared in document B by the person arguing for slavery in Georgia, the idea that there is an economic necessity to it, that in order for the South to remain, in order for the agriculture of the region to remain economically viable and be an engine that drives the country, that slaves are needed because obviously it would be a cheaper option than to pay those people. So anyway, that was some of the documents that were introduced to you on Tuesday. With regard to today's work, as I scroll regard to today's work, we're going to look more at Frederick Douglass. I mean, he is the reason why the unit is called the 4th of July in the first place. His autobiography is very well known. Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 in February. We're actually not sure about when he, what his exact birth date was, and I'll let you think about why it is that we don't know exactly when Frederick Douglass was born. what day in February. But he lived until, I believe, 1795. At the age of 20, in 1838, he escaped from slavery. He had lived a lot of his life on a Maryland plantation, but then he was actually working in and out of Baltimore and had some experience, I believe, as a sailor while still enslaved. So I just chose his autobiography isn't terribly long, but it's really amazing, the first person account that it grants you. So if you ever get a chance to pick it up, I have a copy in my classroom. Obviously, we're not there right now, but I chose different parts that I thought might be of some interest to you. So on page 19, it talks about who his mother was, as it mentions here, Harriet Bailey. And then it talks about who his father may have been. He's never exactly sure what his relationship is with his mother. It's truly heartbreaking to actually read about that, especially as it gets into the second and third paragraphs here. So the questions I ask you aren't terribly long, but I do hope you take the time to read some of these, and it might give you a better perspective about what his life was like. It's impossible for us to sort of understand, like, well, boy, this must have been. I think it does people who had to go through such trauma a disservice for us to imagine what it would have been like for us to do that, because our lives are so much different than his life was. But at the same time, I think we can still read and appreciate what he had to go through, and to make those connections is a natural thing to do when you compare, the relationships that exist in our lives compared to the relationships that existed in his life. The second one I give you, page 26 here, at least according to my copy of the autobiography, it just talks about, well, I guess this is sort of one of the questions I ask you, but it's very a matter of fact going over about how the how materials and resources were delivered to slaves on Douglass's plantation. The third reading talks about how he suffered the most. And the question here, number 3, what gave Frederick the most physical pain as a child? Again, this is written in his own autobiography. And then the fourth one and the last one from page 46, it talks about Douglass and his master's wife and the relationship that he had with her as a young boy, and how her feelings towards him changed. They do a complete 180, and he goes into that a little bit. So anyway, that's today's. The 4 readings are there. There are 6 questions that I expect you to do, and those are due on Monday. So usually we have a little quiz at the end of the week. We don't have one of those now this week, but hopefully you will take a look at this reading and really appreciate sort of what he had to go through as a young man. All right, I will check in with you again on Monday. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. If you have concerns, tomorrow I'll make available some reassessment options for people. If you got your Foreign Affairs Unit test back and would like to improve that, then I will certainly work out something so that we can get those grades improved. All right, have a nice Thursday, everybody, and hopefully, well, it looks like the snow's already melted from my yard, so I guess that's a good sign. All right, bye, everyone.